Hi everyone, welcome back to Art Lessons with Rossi, and today we're going to be working on an acrylic painting. And this acrylic painting is going to be a portrait. And in this scenario I am creating a portrait of my sister and her son, my nephew. And I am going to take two printed versions of this photograph, and I'm going to translate this photograph onto my canvas. I'm going to do that by using a grid. The way that you create a grid on a piece in order to translate it on a bigger canvas is you will take your printed photograph and put a small grid on it. In this case, this 8.5 by 11, I've used 1 to 1 inch ratio grid on this. So each of these squares is 1 inch wide and 1 inch tall. After I placed the grid onto the photograph, I also lettered and numbered the grid so I can figure out which part of the grid I am at. So here at the top, I've lettered A through H, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. And on the side, I've numbered 1 through 11. That's how many different little squares that I have. And I've numbered and lettered even the ones that I only have a little bit of, that it's not a full square. Then I have taken the ratio of this photograph and translated it onto a slightly bigger canvas. So this is a 1 to 1 ratio. The photograph, I actually measured how tall or how big this section of my photograph is, and I've divided it by how tall my canvas is. So in this case, this canvas is 14 inches tall, and the photograph in the image that I'm working at is 10.5 inches tall. So I've taken 14, divided it by 10.5. And the ratio that I came up with is that if through that division, I could make a grid onto this canvas that is 1.25 inch, so 1 1/4, and by 1 1/4, and then I would have the same ratio of the photograph onto the canvas itself. And so I measured that with my ruler and then used a pencil to create this grid. I also put the same numbering and lettering system on the top of my canvas, A through H, or excuse me, H through I, and 1 through 11. Now I'm going to start using the canvas, the photograph itself, in order to translate what I see in each of these little squares onto my canvas. So now that I want to start translating what I see in each of these squares onto my canvas, I have to really think about what I do see in each of these squares. So if I start to think about what do I see in 1A, and in 1A I really only see the background. It's really in 1B that I start to see the top of my sister's forehead. In 2A, I still only basically see the background, and in 2B, I actually start to see more of my sister's forehead. So I want to start here in these in this first or second row with B1 and B2. And I'm going to translate that in B1 and B2 on my canvas. Again, the ratio of these two squares are the same, but the one on the canvas is larger than the one on the printed copy. The easiest way to do this is to actually block out so you don't see anything but the square that you are currently working on. And I'm actually gonna, I'll show you guys why, but if you notice, this first row isn't actually 1 inch high. It's just a little bit smaller than that. And so I have to be careful not to over exaggerate this first square. So I'm going to start here in the second square where I know that that ratio is exactly the same, while here I actually, this square probably only goes to about here on that, the ratio of this section. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to block out what I see, everything that I see except for the square of B2. And by doing so, I can really start to think about the forms that I'm looking at rather than thinking about the fact that this is my sister. What does that mean? So when it comes to translating what I see in this square to how I'm going to place it here, is I'm thinking about this vertical line versus the horizontal lines that are underneath it. And what I see in this square is that the form of my sister's forehead starts probably about a fifth of the way in on this vertical line. And I am also thinking, where does this part of my sister's forehead start? And are they on the exact same line? Is this little section right at the same mark? And I think that this one is just a little bit further in. And this one, if I was thinking about that as a vertical line here too, is just slightly further out. Now I want to think, what is the shape that I see here? Where is this curve that I see here that is creating that, again, part of her forehead, but I can think about the curve that I see rather than the fact that it's a facial feature. So I see something like this. And again, I'm really concentrating on this section, the line that is horizontal, vertical, horizontal, and this curve. And I'm looking and I'm saying, yeah, if I compare those two, it's pretty close to what I see. Then I'm going to actually move down and start to draw what I see in the next section. So again, instead of thinking about this as a part of a forehead, I'm really thinking about it in terms of a form. Once again, I want to compare, if this is the bottom of that square, where do I see this change in value from this dark background to my sister's forehead directly? And it's a little bit more than half. So if this is halfway through on that square, it's a little bit more than half that I see this part starting. And it seems to slope up and to the side, and then very quickly start to maybe curve in just a little bit, and then reach this other part. And now I can look at these two sections together and really think, am I drawing that correctly? Do they look basically the same as what I have on the photograph? And I think that they're pretty good. Maybe this is just a little bit less sloped than what I have. So something like that. So now let's go to that B4. So now I'm going to look at just this one section. And now the form is starting to become slightly more complex, but I can still break it apart into these really simple forms. So thinking about this, I know that the form ends here, but then I see that this section of the form comes back out. It's almost halfway through this horizontal line. And then up from the bottom, that dark form ends around here, starting that light form, which is actually her eye. And let's see if I can get my hand out of the way. And then what I believe I'm seeing is that this form starts to slope upward, starts to curves pretty dramatically, and from the top kind of comes out, is creating her eyebrow, and then let's see if I can get that. It's doing something like this. Like this fuzzy part, which is her eyebrow, is out here. It's doing something, this shape is what I'm trying to capture, so it's doing something like a very strange letter C. And maybe it's actually closer to this line, a little bit closer to that line from what I can see. And then here, within this form, this darker line starts about here and is kind of creating a triangle form. down this way. And then there's a darker form in here, which is actually her eyelashes. I'm going to move the top of that so I can see how this form is actually going upward and is creating this shape, which again I was calling kind of like a C shape, like the letter C. And I want to make sure that I'm drawing that correctly, so I'm going to just refine and look at that again, make sure that it looks right. I'm even going to put it on the same level so that I can make sure that's correct. And then right above this, I also see a shadow. So there's a shadow in here. And if I draw the shape of that shadow, it's going to really help me understand that form even further, not just this dark line, but also the shadow above it. Okay, so let's see. In the next one after that, in B5, I don't see anything. But in B6, in this one, let me move down so you guys can see. So in B6, in this one, I start to see a little form that I believe is the top of the baby's head. So it starts, let's see if I can get there. So this is B6. It starts around. So if I look at the rectangle, or excuse me, the square, it starts lower than half. And on this vertical line, so what I'm looking at is here, this starts, if I'm looking at from this top horizontal to that bottom vertical for that square, this starts at about a little bit lower than half. And then this one is a little bit to the right of half as well, something like that. And I'm really thinking about how this is sloping. It's not a very curved form, it's actually a little bit flat, something like that. So we're going to do that for each of these squares. So I'm going to break out the eye for you guys as well, so you can see how to handle a more complicated form. The biggest trick is to not look at these, not look at this as an eye. Instead, really thinking about it in terms of form. So getting your brain and tricking your brain to not really seeing these shapes as an eye, and making sure that you're thinking about them as form. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to draw this dark little shape that I see is starting just to the right of this vertical line. So it's somewhere here, and it connects to this other form, but I also want to make sure that what I actually am drawing is what I see, and it looks something like this. So this little form, and maybe mine is a little bit fat, and it may actually need to be a little bit more skinny. Let's see if I can fix it. So I feel like it's actually just a little bit more sloped and doing something like that. So just being very careful about these shapes and forms. Now this is, let's go up to this section, and I can think about where this line starts, and I can really start to break that up into something that's curving upward, and then maybe even creating the shadow that I see first instead of going all the way around the eye, which is actually quite difficult to do. It's hard to draw long, skinny things. Instead, I can think, okay, there's a little triangle here, then I see a shadow that kind of goes down. Let me see if I can get that shape. Then I can think about this eye as the bottom of that shape. Then that form is creating a little triangle, and I'm going to curve it a little bit further down. And now I'm going to really think about, what is this shape? What is happening here that's creating the side of her nose? Intellectually, I know that that's what it is, but instead I want to think about it as the edge of this vertical and horizontal line, and then how that's curving downward, where that form is going to end compared to that horizontal line, and how it's going to go up. So something like that. Now I want to think, okay, I know that the bottom of the eye is ending somewhere in here. Compared to this part of the nose, if I think about where this line is in comparison to this vertical line, it's just a little bit lower than half. So it's somewhere in there. And what I see is a long skinny triangle in here, this shape. And I'm going to actually try to draw that first. So something that kind of goes up, and then it kind of comes back down to create that form. There's even a darker area in here that I can look at. Now, when I think about what I see a really dark line that's coming right next to that form. This might even be a little bit more curved than I have it. And then the top eyelid is going to end somewhere right in there. And I'm going to connect these two. And I'm going to look at it, make sure that it's correct. I feel like this might be just a little bit higher. And you can see that dark shape that's the upper eyelid. And I can draw in that shape. Now I can really look to see whether I have these eyelash forms correct. They actually get thicker in here, so I can draw the thickness of that eyelash. Something like this. Then what we're looking at here, this little moon, this little crescent, is the interior of the eyelid. Really important part when we're looking at that 3/4 view portrait, that there's this thickness that goes around the eye of the eyelid. Now I can start thinking about the white of the eye. And so really looking at this form and thinking about its shape, and really not thinking about the color part of the eye yet, but rather trying to create the negative space, that white of the eye, and thinking about where does it start, how sloped is it where it starts and hits that upper eyelid, where does it start to come in, and where does it end. So something like that. I feel like mine might actually not be thick enough. I can, if I feel like something's really off and I feel like I need to correct it, I can grab either a white eraser or a kneaded eraser. And so what I think is happening here is that the white of the eye is even thicker, wider than I had originally drawn it, something like this. And it's really important to take your time here and just continue to look. What I also see are some highlights. There's one here, there's another one underneath that. There's also one right next to that eye. There's a highlight that's going vertically, that's inside of the pupil. And then that pupil is starting here. So let's see if I can figure out where that pupil actually goes. And there's still something off about my drawing. As you can see, that's starting to look cross-eyed. So we don't want that. What's wrong? I think that still the white of the eye that I've drawn on this side is not the right shape. So I'm going to correct it. And I want you guys to really take your time and do this part. It takes hours. This is not a fast process. Working with a grid is really precise. You have a lot of information right in front of you. You need a good photograph so that you can really start to see those highlights and shadows. You don't want to be working off of something that is low resolution, so try to find a high resolution photo. And don't give up. It takes practice, and it takes playing with it, and also just stepping back and looking at it again and again, because again, that's not quite right, and I think that it's really important for us to get it right. That's why I wanted to show you guys a complicated form, and I also want you guys to see that you have to keep trying. You can't just give up and say, it's fine. It's really not. It's actually not fine. You want to get that form correct. If you don't get that form correct, you're going to spend a lot of time painting on something that has a crooked eye. And then if I go and try to give this to my sister as a present, she's going to be like, oh, well, thank you so much, but why are my eyes crooked? And that's really embarrassing. So making sure that that eye is correct is going to be important. In class, you hear me say all the time that one of my favorite things is messing up in front of you, because then you get to see how I problem solve something, because none of us are perfect, and it's always tricky. Like, no matter how good you are, the forms are always hard, and taking your time and doing them right is how we not only get better and how we learn. It's always going to be, things are going to challenge you all the time. It doesn't matter how much experience you have. So I am so much more happy with the eye now than I was just a little bit ago when I had messed up. And what I mean by messing up is that the form wasn't right. The placement of the pupil wasn't right. And I could see that they, as I was comparing them and looking back and forth between them, that they weren't similar enough, and I had to go back and correct it. So again, don't be afraid of doing that. I am going to continue on with this portrait, and the rest of this is going to be as a time lapse, and I'll have it in view right in front of me so that you can see both squares. I'll probably move this photograph on underneath the canvas itself, so that again I'm just looking at one little section at a time, but also you can see me draw and you can see the photograph at the same time. So the rest of this video will be a time lapse of me doing this drawing. And now you can see that I have, again, looked at every one of those little squares and translated them onto my bigger canvas, really paying attention to the planner analysis, looking at where shadows and highlights are, and blocking out those areas that are going to really help me be able to paint that correctly. The next step to do for this portrait is to seal the drawing. So use some workable fixative and spray the drawing, because we'll be painting directly over that, but having the drawing still accessible for us and not smearing and smudging will help us with our underpainting. At this point, it's also useful to have another printout, one that does not have a grid on it, so that we can start to really look at those highlights and shadows and make sure that we have everything now that the proportions are correct.